The Israel-Palestine problem. Welcome to part 4 in the series of 4 presentations where we're looking at this problem that is causing so much anguish to so many people in this present day and age. The Israel-Palestine problem. In the first part, I traced in the kind of background of history to show how we are where we are today. And in the second part, we looked at the Old Testament and asked, what does it say about the future for Israel and the land? Before we looked in part 3 at the New Testament and what it reveals. The picture on the screen is like a jigsaw. The parts overlap, interlock, and indeed there are places where other parts need to interlock and overlap from beyond and outside. Time prevents from going any further. It is complicated, and all sorts of ideas have effects upon each other. But I hope this is an introduction to the whole problem, and will reveal to us areas where we have to do things and rethink things and take action. And that basically is the theme of this fourth part, moving on. Moving on the basis of the background of the history and what the Bible says about it. Throughout, I have tried to base everything on evidence. Evidence from multiple sources. At the bottom, I do note that there's a lack of Islamic sources. We'll see in a moment perhaps some insights as to why. But the sources of evidence I've taken are widespread. In trying to base the conclusions and decisions on the best evidence, and particularly the second bottom one, biblical scholarship. There are great men and women of God who have got the knowledge, the experience and the insight to explain to us what the Old Testament and the New Testament really mean. And this allows us to move our thinking forward. And that's what we're going to do now, moving on, trying to be positive and seeing something where we can make a contribution. Yes, throughout this series there have been things that I'm sure you've found uncomfortable, and there'll be more in this part. But I'm still inviting you, keep your brain suspended, weigh the evidence, look for the evidence. I've based it on evidence, not opinion, not books, not novels, not even experience much, but evidence. Weigh the evidence and ask whether we're understanding the situation correctly today. The Israel-Palestine problem. This map's come up again and again. This tiny land, so critical in its location, linking Africa to Asia and Europe. A land which can be cultivated and can support people, unlike many of the lands around, which are almost entirely desert. What's the future for this land? And what's the future for the people who are living on that land, some of whom are suffering greatly today? Is there any way forward? Or in practical terms, is there anything we can do? Or are we too small and insignificant? I hope I'm going to be able to argue and show there are things that we can do that are practical to address the Israel-Palestine problem. The first problem is getting at the truth. Getting at the truth, the facts on the ground today are not easy. Getting at the truth in the understanding of what the Bible says, we've absorbed so many things that are just simply not right. It's very difficult to shake ourselves free from this and come to this afresh. It's uncomfortable. You probably at times have been angry with what I've been saying, but I've based it on evidence, not opinion. Getting at the truth is near impossibility. We've got to recognize that. There's a very efficient, massive Israeli media machine, both in the country itself and in America. And this presents things as the Jews wish it to be presented. Not always presenting it in the best possible way. Now add to that the other side, there is no massive Palestinian media machine. But the Palestinians often work on a level of make-believe almost. Wishful thinking, what they would like things to be. But they're impossible. And we have to see through that to what's behind that. And then Most Palestinians that are left in Palestine today are Muslims. The Christians have been driven out because they were better educated. They were able to get out more easily. But they were driven out, not recognized either by the Jews, and then they were persecuted by the Muslims that were left. But Islam, as part of its thought form, has got what I've called a blame culture. No matter what goes wrong, it's always someone else's fault because Islam is perfect. Islam is God's religion. It is the best way. That's part of the teaching of the Quran. And it's inbuilt in Islamic societies. And therefore, you point the finger at other people. Moving around such countries, I've seen this again and again and again, in all sorts of contexts and all sorts of situations. But you see it also in the Muslim communities in the West. Don't blame the Muslims for doing this. It's just part of the culture that's come from Islam's way of thinking. Others are always at fault. And then there are very powerful Jewish lobbies in the United States. They are inordinately powerful, and they're inordinately wealthy as well. And they can put enormous pressure on the situation, and it's difficult to break through and find out what actually is happening. What is the truth? By contrast, the Arab supporters, so-called, of the Palestinians often haven't done very much. They often say lots, but they don't do very much. And perhaps they're not capable of doing very much. And that stands in stark contrast to this powerful supporting Jewish lobby supported by Christian Zionists. Getting at the truth is not easy. Because our press in the West, I'm going to say, is deluded. Not entirely. Not that they're telling lies. It's just that what they're telling isn't the entire picture. And our politicians, either deliberately by choice or misled by the lack of information, are often misled as to what actually is going on and what the facts are. It doesn't make life easy to wade through this lot. And if anyone accuses anything to do with Arabs or Islam or the Muslim faith, immediately you're accused of Islamophobia. So the media is terrified of this accusation. And it tiptoes round things and it won't criticise what's going on. But equally, there's the accusations of anti-Semitism. Anyone who doesn't support the Jews lock, stock and barrel, no matter what they do, is liable to be hurled at as they're an anti-Semite. And we have to admit there's some terrible things been done against the Jewish people in the world, historically, originating from Christians, tragically and sadly. So we're caught with this. We don't want to criticize people from the Islamic world because of accusations. We don't want to criticize people in the Jewish world because of accusations. So do we actually get at the truth? It's not easy. And I'm going to make that statement, and it's widely held by those who studied this. Just accept that distortion of the truth is the norm. Whatever you read, just ask the questions. Is this really the whole truth? Or is it a selective part that gives the wrong impression, or an inaccurate impression, or an incomplete impression? It is difficult to break through. That's why I've used so many sources, so many diverse sources, trying to bring things together to make some sort of sense of this. Not easy. We touched upon the chosen race concept. That underpins Christian Zionism. It also underpins much of Jewish thinking today, although most people in Israel are secularists and don't carry that view. In the biblical sense, chosenness is always chosen for a task. Not chosen because we're specially good, not chosen because God likes us, not chosen for heaven or a destiny, but chosen to do something. And once you grasp that, it changes the concept of chosenness completely. The Jews are the chosen race in the sense that God chose to make himself known to Abraham. Abraham responded. And God chose Abraham and his descendants to be the people through whom God would make contact with the world, which he did through the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. But the aim was to bless all nations. Not to make Abraham feel good, not to give Abraham a province of heaven, but to bless all the people groups round about. but it brings responsibility. If we're going to do what God wants, we've got to follow God in obedience. Otherwise we won't achieve it. We have to do it His way because He knows what the best way is. And the whole system of prophecy throughout the Old Testament, and indeed in the New, but less so, is the reminders given by God's great men and women that there's a call of God demands a higher standard and greater responsibilities. They need to respond. God gives the grace to enable them to respond, but we need to be willing. We take the decision, God provides the enabling. That's what prophetic words are all about. They are not celestial timetables. They were spoken to people in their day and age for a purpose. And the people of God, non-Jews, were welcomed. We'll look at that in a moment. They were welcomed into God's people. It was not racial purity. It was not ethnic cleansing. That needs to be restored today. And the prophets were looking forward to a time when barriers between Jews and non-Jews would finally be broken down, and the outreach would go to all people groups, all ethnic groups, everywhere. In the latter part of the Jewish nation before the days of Jesus, much more exclusive views started to dominate. You see them very clearly with the Sadducees, but more particularly with the Pharisees in the days of Jesus. We are the in-group, we're God's favourite people, we know what we're talking about, and all the rest of you are rabble. And they said it in as many words in the days of Jesus to Jesus. That is not consistent with the biblical picture. Now just what's happening today. We've set up, or allowed to be set up, a Jewish nation state which is racially separate. Intermarriage, no. The land is Jewish by right, racially determined. The Temple Mount is Jewish by right. The fact that there's a mosque on it, replacing a church which replaced the temple, Herod's temple, that's irrelevant. And any means are permissible for success. So the concept of chosenness has got dangers with it. And therefore dissenting voices are sidelined. There are many dissenting voices within the Jewish communities in Israel. But they're sidelined. Remember, media management comes in very strongly. And they're just ignored. So that a certain political correctness appears in that culture. You see the same in the West today. Our media is managed in the sense that political correctness rules in the ruling class that work in running our country and our media. It's much stronger in Israel today. Now that leads to areas of gross discrimination, that concept of chosenness. It's okay just to destroy our homes, to bulldoze them, just take the land, tear up title deeds. 70% of the West Bank, 40% of Gaza taken by 2000. Palestinians forbidden to register any land, and any older documents are just ripped up. Arab village have just been wiped out. Inhabitants expelled, the land taken over, and when they're out of the country, they can't get back in, even if they want to visit families in other places. The water supplies are monopolized. Palestinians have restricted water access. And you can see today Palestinian children desperate for a drink of water, while they can see, just in a neighbouring area, Jewish families watering their lawns. Isn't that discrimination? What about travel restrictions? All sorts of identity cards, coded, and if you've got an ID card you must have it shown on request, and if you're not you'll be arrested. And these blocks in the roads often block access to hospitals. So women going into childbirth, husbands trying to take them to a maternity unit, they don't get through. Nothing gets through. People are ill, people have heart attacks. Too bad, they don't get through. If necessary, they will die. Education is pushed down. Not allowed resources, so the Palestinian workforce are not educated well. That just leads to poverty. Trial and imprisonment without legal representation, that's the norm. Frequently released months or years later without any charges ever being brought. No right of any sort of restoration of rights there. Arrested, interrogated at a whim. Torture, 58% of cases. Now all of this is documented from sources that are highly reliable, sources that are neutral. Violence. The rubber bullets that are used will kill. And the tear gas they're using is concentrated, so it is poisonous. And it's okay to kill people on the streets. A third of the children of Gaza today have suffered this. Is this moral? Is this ethical? Is it just? Is this the way any so-called people of God should behave? The universities' position is completely precarious. United Nations, recognizing all of this, declared Zionism as racist in 1975. The United States, under pressure from the Jewish lobby, pressurized the UN to withdraw it. But in fact, it's basically still true. The country is racist, and it's a peculiar inconsistency that so many countries of the world launch so much criticism against South Africa over its racist policies, white over black, but are not prepared to make the same statements when the same thing is happening in Israel, where Jews and non-Jews are being treated in this racist way. More recently, a UN investigation found 17 laws that are explicitly based on racial discrimination. No equality before the law. A chosen race? You see the dangers it can lead to, this kind of thought form. But a lot of this will probably be new to you. Took a bit of raking through to find it. It doesn't get to us in the West. But the sources of evidence are consistent, and they're confirmed by several sources. This is broad brush an accurate picture of what actually is going on today. And what about torture? I'm not going to make your stomachs revolt by reading the whole thing through. It's horrendous. Now, the Israeli High Court ruled against it in 1999, but Amnesty International, which is completely independent, it reports its continued use. Now, this so often happens when you get governments saying that they're not going to do something or do something, but in fact they just ignore it. Human rights being the most obvious example, where some of the countries that are signatories are the worst perpetrators of the lack of human rights. In the West, the US gives $3.5 billion. And look at the arms sales. Zero to Palestinians other than what they can acquire from other Arab nations by devious routes. It's one-sided. But what I'm pleading for is that torture can never be right. And torture being used to carry out any supposed will of God must be wrong. Must be wrong. Abram was promised the land for his descendants. He never appropriated anything. He bought one tiny piece, and that was simply to have a burial place for his wife. The Old Testament makes it absolutely clear that land possession for the Israeli country and nation is an outgrowth of obedience to a covenant that was given first of all to Abraham. And the goal that God had in mind was blessing other nations. And it would come by God's people living ethically. We did compare the standards Joshua set compared to the standards of the nations. They're different as chalk and cheese. God's people. Justice. God wants justice. That's a biblical thrust. How does that compare with what's happening today? And as someone said, the same Bible that bears the promises of God likewise bears the expectations of God. For God's people at all times, in every circumstance, God comes with the offer. God makes and takes the initiative of a covenant. We must respond, but in our response, there is a moral and ethical standard demanded of us to be the people of God. Where is that insight, that biblical insight, gone with the behavior of the Jewish people today? And if you criticize them for it, you immediately get attacked for, but there's terrorists all around and suicide bombers. I am not justifying terrorism. I am totally opposed to suicide bombing. That doesn't justify anything. But you can't point the finger at other people when your own house is badly out of order. This has got to be faced with honesty. When they came into the land, just before it, that's what God said, do not move your neighbour's boundary stone, set up by your predecessors in the inheritance you receive in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess. Cursed is anyone who moves their neighbour's boundary stone. Compared to that, how does driving Palestinians out of their homes and villages, bulldozing their homes, appropriating the land, monopolizing the water supplies, that's the equivalent of moving your neighbour's boundary by your predecessors. Do not ill-treat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt, says Moses. Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt at a different place in Exodus. That all comes from the Old Testament, which the Jews are supposed to follow. And Amos hammers the nation of Israel, the northern nation. I hate. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. These are strong words. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. These words are still being spoken prophetically over all God's people, wherever they are. And we can get into our church groups and sing our songs and go through our religious performances as much as we like. But if we are not letting justice roll, honesty, integrity, truth, righteousness, treating others top of the pile, putting ourselves out for the benefit of the other, serving the world around, the suffering servant of Jesus, it all counts for nothing. And Isaiah wistfully, as God saying that, we look for justice, but find none. For deliverance, but it is far away. You see, if you don't have justice, you don't expect God to deliver you. It will elude you. And Israel will never have peace while it's perpetrating injustice. It's got to put its house in order. That is the principle of the Old Testament. And there were two criteria that were used. The same law for the foreign and the native born. Where does racism fit into that? Now I charge you in the sight of all Israel and all the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God, be careful to follow all the commands of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and pass it on as an inheritance to your descendants forever. The inference we can draw straight away is, if you don't, you'll lose it. The land is contingent upon our behavior. And it is not our land as of right. That runs right throughout the Old Testament. There are major dilemmas for Israel today. These are debates that are within the country. Is Israel going to be a free and open democracy? Free for all of equal rights? Or is it to see itself as an exclusively Jewish state? That's a debate that's going on in Israel today. Is it going to be a people which are secular with high ideals? Or is it just going to be a religious state for the Jews? That debate and dilemma, and it runs right across the Jewish world, is a divide. And people take their position all along these axes. Ben-Gurion, the famous leader of the past in the Jewish world, made the point that Israel cannot be a Jewish state and an owner of the land and a democracy at the same time. If it's to be a democracy, then others have the rights. And if it's to hold all the land with its Arab residents, then it can't be exclusively Jewish. There's a contradiction there. And these are the dilemmas that Israel has got to face today. And they're not going to be easy dilemmas to face. It wants all the land and also be Jewish. And it can't be democracy because the Arabs just have to be pushed out. And that's the way it's going. Ben-Gurion was very perceptive. There is a problem. There is a dilemma. It needs to be resolved. Let's look a bit at how, in the Old Testament story, foreigners were absorbed. 2 Samuel speaks about Saul's son had two men leaders of raiding bands. One named Bana, another Rechab. And it tells you who their sons are. Who they were sons of. And it speaks about the fact that they are foreigners to this day. It was not racial purity. It was closer to getting to spiritual purity. In 2 Samuel, the mighty men of David are listed, and amongst them there are four there: Eliphelet, Igal, Zelek, and Uriah. And the origin of where they are descended from is Syria, Lebanon, Ammon, and Turkey, in today's countries. 4 neighbouring countries. They were among the mighty men, the great supporters of King David, king of the entire United Nation of Israel. And all of them descended from foreigners. David gave orders to assemble the foreigners residing in Israel, and from among them he appointed stone cutters to prepare dressed stone for building the house of God. He looked for people with the right skills. The foreigners were more used to it than his own people. The temple, which was built actually by his son Solomon and completed then, was built, at least in this part, by foreigners, non-Jews. And Solomon took a census. Now we have to watch interpreting numbers because the Hebrew language does not have a number system within it. But whatever is true, there were a lot of them. It wasn't ethnic cleansing. Including the foreigners who'd come from Israel and also those who resided in Jacob. All of these people were part of the great celebration of the temple opening. You see, it's inclusive. God is always inclusive. He is open and accessible to anybody and everybody. And he provides the way. But how are we to sort all this out? the issues the Palestinians have. At the moment, all their legal rights have been stripped away, and they've received very little help from the United Nations and very limited help from Arab countries. The only help that's come is mainly from extremists in other Arab countries. And we in the West have allowed this to happen because we have not looked at the situation objectively. And their hope is just evaporating. Just talk to them. Hopelessness written all over their lifestyle. They have not been supported. They simply do not understand the Christian Zionist position. How can people who believe in the book as they see it support what the Jews are doing to us and abusing us and all the loss of human rights? They just can't understand it. And as a result, any Christians amongst the Palestinians suffer because they're labelled along with these Christian Zionists. But the Christians that are Palestinians can't understand the Christian Zionists. In fact, Christians in general don't understand Christian Zionists because the Christian Zionist position is simply not based on any biblical understanding that's recognizable. Palestinian Christians have suffered horrendously at the hands of the Jews, at the hands of the Muslim Arabs, and at the hands of the world. The media has ignored their plight, as the media has ignored the Christian minorities in Syria today, as the media has ignored the Christians who have fled from Iraq after the disasters of the Iraq wars. And these people have suffered, crying out for help. And the West has done very little. Godly and wonderful organizations, Christian organizations in the West, have gathered money and resources to do something for them. But our media has ignored them. It's not politically correct to support Christians, is the fashion today. And the Palestinians are divided. They don't have resources. They have nothing they can draw on. They have nothing. But they don't even agree with each other. And sometimes it breaks out into strife. And that allows extremists to get into power. And these extremists promise the impossible. If it's too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. And there's more and more extremity coming in because of desperation. Do not blame the Palestinians. They've been driven to this. I am not saying that what happens is right, not for 1 minute. But these people have become so desperate they will cling to anything. They're just crying out for some justice. That's what God wants. God is for justice. But our Palestinians, who are human beings just like you and me, they're crying out for it, and they don't get it. They don't get it from the Jewish nation. They don't get it from the United Nations. They don't get it from the Arab nations round about, and they don't get it from the West, and our media don't treat it fairly. It's manipulated. We've got to go back and look at the Old Testament prophets. They thumped away at injustice. They hammered it. And the Quran is different. Because the Quran takes the line, if someone does something to you, you retaliate. And that's what underpins much of what's going on with what we call terrorism from the Palestinians. They're bred to retaliation. I choose one little bit here, but it comes again and again in the Quran. Retaliation is decreed for you Muslims in bloodshed. Kill people if necessary. In retaliation, you have a safeguard for your lives. The only way to make sure you get a fair deal is to retaliate. Use force to get what you need. You can see where that appears in the Palestinian mindset. Now, most Muslims would never dream of following this. But the extremists play on this, and it's in the Quran again and again, so the extremists have got it right. What about the Christian dimension? I think we've got to hang our heads in shame. We've come up from biblical interpretations that are just so far away from what Paul, for example, reveals. And we've pronounced them with an arrogance and a superiority that is frighteningly awful. we have also been responsible for generating anti-Semitism, directly or indirectly. Now it has reversed since the horrendous things that happened in Germany in the Second World War under Hitler, since that news came out and that media was managed. So now we're so pro-Jewish in the West that the poor Palestinians suffer. But we started the anti-Semitism. We've misunderstood the whole idea of election and choice. Choice is never for a destiny like heaven. Choice is for a task. And we've misunderstood the idea of God's predetermination of the future. Yes, God knows where things are going. God is all-seeing and all-knowing. Humans have choice. God doesn't push us around that way. And we have put understandings in prophecy that simply cannot be sustained. We've not even understood the nature of prophecy. Prophecy is not celestial fortune telling. Prophecy is great men and women of God speaking the mind of God into a situation. And we failed to grasp that the message of Jesus is available for everybody in the world. No one's beyond the pale. And in the West, we have failed to understand the Islamic mindset. I produced a series on what does the Quran teach. We've generated ideas that are wrong. We don't understand the Islamic mindset. We don't understand what the Quran actually teaches, which is devastatingly frightening. Most Muslims have come to different conclusions, and we don't treat the Muslims with the respect that they deserve. We pussyfoot around the issue with political correctness because we don't understand it, and as a result our politicians have done things in the Middle East that have completely undone any good it could ever do, because we've not understood the Islamic mindset. It is not Western. It is different, and we need to understand it, and it comes from the Quran, so we've got to start with the Quran. And we need to realize that the teachings of the Bible are nothing to do with any future ingatherings of Jews or any restoration of the land. That is simply not in the Bible. We have put it in and we've bent and twisted text to justify something that we've believed in for ourselves. It's not there, and it could not be there because it contradicts the spiritual principles of what Jesus came to do and be. And what about Britain? Now, we didn't start the anti-Semitism on our own. It's everywhere. And indeed, Eastern Europe was particularly bad at it. It's been right there for centuries, for a millennia and a half at least. But we passed the Balfour Act, which with its inbuilt contradiction, which produces an impossibility. We broke our promises at the end of the First World War. We didn't protest, and people in Germany, only some protested over what Hitler was doing. And indeed, during the 1930s, there were campaigns run by the media in the West to refuse to take in refugees trying to get out of Germany because they understood what was going to happen to them. We are responsible for many of them being consigned to death chambers. And we're doing the same to immigrants today, sending people back to torture and death and persecution. So we overreacted to the Holocaust, which was horrendous. What was done to the Jews in Germany was horrendous. But let's remember, for all the millions that Hitler killed, Stalin probably killed 3 times as many. And it covered more than just the Jews. Mostly were not. But our overreaction to the Holocaust has meant destruction to Palestinians. And we are quite happy to let Israel ignore UN resolutions, while if other countries ignore them, we run campaigns and even declare war against them, as with Iraq. Utter inconsistency. Now that is seen by the Arab world, the Muslim world. That utter inconsistency. Hypocrisy, if you like. I think we need to say sorry. We made a bit of a mess of it. got it wrong. In the West in general, in Britain in particular, in the Christian world, we got it wrong. We've contributed to the problems. I suppose that's some of the big players on the scene today. These two groups are totally unequal. Israel is financed and supported by the wealthiest country in the world, America, in terms of giving. Palestinians get almost nothing, and they lack any real support from the Arab world. What a contrast. There's an uneasy relationship. The Americans need Arab oil, but there's not really a position of trust there. And the way of thinking, the mindset is different. The American mindset is conditioned by Western European, biblical, Judeo-Christian ways of thinking. The Arabic world is conditioned by Islamic ways of thinking. They are not the same. They are utterly different. And to pretend otherwise, because both are founded on religions that believe in one God, the God of the Quran is totally different in concept from the God of the Bible. And we just have to look at them to recognize this. And we often pretend it's otherwise. There's an uneasy relationship there. And there's a manipulative control. Because the Christian Zionists and the Zionists in America know that they can bring down a government and cause somebody who wants to be a president not to be elected. Is that democracy? The Palestinians have lost every war they've been in. They lack the armaments. The few they get come by devious sources, and they're often associated with extremists. That puts them into weakness whenever they go into negotiation. And in fact, any concept of a Palestinian state is just tribal lands, completely dominated and ruled by the decisions of Israel. They're starved of water and resources, and they're impossibly divided amongst themselves. The omens are not good. Palestinians are not gun-running extremists as of nature. The vast majority are ordinary, decent people trying to scrape a living, who just want peace and quiet, who will offer you kindness and hospitality like anybody else. But the way they've been treated has driven them into an impossible situation. And the Arab world is disunited, often paralyzed. They don't have agreed policies. Yes, there's much shouting and mouthing off of rhetoric, but not much actually happens. As a result, Islamists, those who hold extreme positions, gain ground, gain ground, gain ground all the time. And some of the governments of Arab nations are terrified of this. It's won every war, so it enters negotiations from a position of strength. It's been armed and protected by the US since the nation was formed in 1948, and Golda Meir negotiated with the government in the United States then. It controls the water and resources. And it has managed media presentation so cleverly, brilliantly, that it presents the Palestinians as terrorists. Let me say, the vast, vast, vast majority of Palestinians are not terrorists, never will be, and don't want to have anything to do with it. But that's the image that comes to the West. Meanwhile, the Jews are creating settlements, slowly dividing up the land, splitting up Palestinian communities, putting them into poverty, every time just pushing them out and encouraging them to leave. And the Americans have backed the Israelis at every stage, simply because the Americans are controlled by the Zionists, who control money and power and votes. It has tried and tried again and again to be a mediator and bring peace. They've really put themselves out. Tremendous credit is due to them. But they can't be seen as neutral by either the Palestinians or the Arabs because of the way they've financed the Israelis. President Clinton alone, of all the American presidents, he began to almost break free from this image, and he made the biggest progress of all. Indeed, I would have said that if he'd been allowed a third term of office, he might have had the breakthrough. The tragedy is he wasn't allowed it because of the rules of his country, good rules. But the Americans have lost world credibility because of the position they've been put in. In the US there are 6 million Jews out of the total population, but the Christian Zionists are maybe 40 million. That's a big vote, and it's a big power block, and it's a lot of money. And these groups have exerted power and policy control relentlessly. They also control much financial power in the country. So as a result, American governments are limited in what they can do. It's an uneasy and grim story of control and manipulation. How are we going to see a way out of this? And is there a way forward? Or for you and me, is there anything we can do, or are we just too small to have anything that we can do this at all? Very briefly as a position. Come to the end. Let me offer some thoughts on this. We've got the Islamic position. And Muslims, when they see themselves not winning battles, they think they're not being zealous enough in their religious zeal. And all that does is it feeds extremism. But the Jews have got strength. And they believe they've got divine right on their side. The Zionist Christian position, completely untenable on the basis of any understanding of the Bible, causing enormous problems. There's the biblical position. It made quite clear, the land is God's. No one's got any divine right to it. Nobody. But from a spiritual point of view, a Christian perspective, the concept of the land is now spiritually redundant. Jesus came to personify Israel, to do what Israel as a nation failed to do, and to achieve it and to release it to the world. We're in a different ballpark. Completely. Given all these things, is conflict inevitable? It seems so. As you've listened to this, perhaps you wanted to attack me and criticize me and condemn me for what I'm saying. I am being scrupulously careful to be as objective as I can, based on the evidence that I have collated from multiple sources, much Jewish. There's a terrible problem today. If somebody doesn't agree with you, then you caricature their views and then you attack the caricature. Please don't do that. There are things I have not said. Don't accuse me of saying them. The other thing people do is they attack the integrity of the messenger as if I'm somehow in the pay of one group or another. Or I'm dishonest. I can't be perfect, but I have looked at all the evidence with as much care as I can muster. And I don't come with any preconceived ideas. And when people attack you with these arguments, walk away. That's destructive. What I'm pleading for is something much, much better. That's all negative. You see enough of that in politics on our television screens every night. We don't want any more. Let's have genuine dialogue, where we say to the other person, I disagree with you totally, but let me hear it again. Let me tell you, why do you hold that view? Five options for Israel, all impossible. The Jews grow the entire state, but simply by breeding rates. It's a matter of time before the Arabs would outnumber the Jews. All being equal, the Jewish people won't allow that. Just driving all the Palestinians out, would the world allow that? But that's the way it's going. The Islamic world wants to drive the Jews into the Mediterranean. Is that reasonable or possible? If you're going to have a two-state solution, it's got to be a proper two-state solution, not tribal areas walled in and controlled by one country, which is what it's moving towards at the moment. These all face horrendous problems. Let's be honest, there are no easy answers to this. And anyone presents easy answers is living in a world of delusion. For the Palestinians, do they go away of violence? Violence is counterproductive. I've argued with them and says, cannot you learn the message of Gandhi in India? They don't get it because the Islamic background doesn't allow them to get it. Retaliation is taught. But most Palestinians don't want violence. Indeed, most people don't want violence. They can't see there's a contradiction here. They want Islamic states all over the world, but they won't allow a Jewish state. What do we do about Israel? You can't undo what's happened in the last decades, maybe even a century. Israel as a nation exists. There's a real problem of human rights in the Islamic world. It's got to be faced with, and the Palestinians are part of this because human rights has suffered, particularly in the Gaza Strip. If you look at the 40 nations in the world with the worst human rights, these lists being gathered by many organisations and widely agreed across these organisations, some of which have no political or religious agendas at all. Amongst the nations with the worst human rights, Islamic nations dominate. The only other group that's there are a few communist states. Islam has got to look at that and put its house in order. There was an opportunity for a compromise in 48. It was turned down. Can that be resurrected in any way? Is it possible? But what the Palestinian nation needs is leadership of integrity. It's divided. Essentially, it's got two leaders. It must come together. Now, these are the issues the Palestinians have got to face. The Israelis want security. The Palestinians are looking for unity and nationhood. Neither wins. Here are two people groups who are losing everything because they're trying to take more than is possible. Proverbs says that. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Set for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. There's a message to you and me. Are we speaking out on behalf of those who are suffering, whoever they may be? Whatever answer comes will bring some injustice to the Jews and some injustice to the Palestinians. You can't put the clock back and rewrite history, sadly. And until both sides recognise that they can't both get all they want, there is no future. True leadership, great leadership will recognise that, but thus far it has failed. What about us today? Stop blaming other people. Let's get down on our knees and accept that we are part of the Christian community that has contributed to the problem. And let's ask his forgiveness. Now that's something you and I can do right away. Maybe not personally we've been involved, but we've been part of a nation and a community. And then let's go and seek forgiveness from Jews, Muslims and Palestinian Christians. I remember on one occasion apologising to a Muslim man from another country in the Middle East over what we in the West had done to the Palestinians. I thought he was going to collapse and have a heart attack with amazement. Breakthroughs will come from this. And one thing we can all do, you and I can do it, get back and read our Bibles and look at what it actually teaches, and get out books, get writing, get speaking, get this taught, get it out. Make sure that we know what the Bible actually says. And then we've got to put pressure on for fairer media coverage and less political posturing from our leaders. Now, using social media, there are many organisations have found the power of social media to make political parties, governments and nations and leaders really uncomfortable. We have that power in our hands if we mobilised. There are enough Christians alone in the United Kingdom to use our power to argue for things and move things forward. We've got to get united and use the modern media to this end. Those are things that practically we can do. We've had a lot of lack of integrity, and in the West, Britain and America, we've been very guilty. Let's face it, the Palestinians have been treated totally inhumanely, and they've been scattered to destruction. And we've allowed it to happen. The Jewish lobby and the Zionist lobby, particularly in America, have been allowed to dominate political decision taking. We've got to do something about it. The silent majority in Islam have got to put Islam's house in order. They're allowing the violent minority. They're not speaking out enough. They're scared to speak out enough. Imams who speak out against it often find that their lives are just cut short, as is happening in Syria today under the so-called Islamic State. The way they're treating non-Muslims and Muslims who disagree with them. One or two imams have spoken out. They've been summarily executed. But somehow in the majority of the Islamic world, and there's a huge majority, who are moderate, reasonable, sensible, wonderful human beings, together they've got to speak out, and perhaps the social media may be the answer for them as well. We've got to repent and admit our wrongdoing on behalf of our own communities. We've got to take what steps we can, which means welcoming them, providing for them, giving to them, supporting them humanitarian-wise in their need. Let's get the truth and get it out. Let's say what the Bible actually teaches. And Islam has got to show a respect for all others. Its record of its lack of respect for minorities is atrocious throughout many of the Islamic states. Not an opinion, it's well documented. Needs to be sorted out. But for us as followers of Jesus, there's our agenda. That's what we can do. Individually, in groups, and across nations with social media. There's an action list. We can take steps. And that's the contribution we can make to the Israel-Palestine problem. There are no neat political solutions. It's a heart and minds exercise, but first of all we've got to get the truth out. We've got to be honest of what we have done or been part of doing. We've got to face up to the issues, and we've got sometimes to apologize. And there are actions we can take together that bit by bit can and will make a difference to the suffering of the people in that part of the world, to bring peace and harmony and hope for two nations who are desperate for something better.